All right, so Genesis chapter 30 tonight. As we continue down the crazy road with some crazy families. So we'll begin kind of get a good look at the beginning of a nation. You know, till now the family tree for what would be the nation of Israel has kind of been more of a stick. One child, one parent, one child. It's kind of like the family tree in Camas, but it's kind of more of a stick than branches. But sorry, I had to. You know, I'm related to probably not exaggerating, close to 50% of the people out there, so I can make that joke. So yeah. So yeah, and so thus the joke always went, you know why there's so many unsolved crimes in Camas Valley, or pick your local small town, because all the DNA is the same and there are no dental records. But once again, when you live there or grew up there, you can make those jokes. So, anyways. But here we're going to have the family tree kind of explode in some craziness. And as we look at this really polygamous family and how many shameful things that they rack up to their account. But for me, it really goes to show that the promises of God are not derailed by the foolishness of man. And I'm thankful for that. That though God had made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how it played out in life, their decisions, the misturnings, all of that, didn't wipe out the promises of God. God is faithful, and He uses the things in our life, good and bad. So it's just a good reminder through this chapter. And I'm thankful for that, the grace of God and His knowledge of beginning to end, knowing where He finds us, what He's going to bring us through, and where He's going to lead us to. So Genesis chapter 30, verse 1. Now when Rachel had saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" So Rachel, she comes out right out of the gate with some envy. That's just kind of boiling up inside of her as her sister has begun to have children, and just the blessing of God on her life in that way. And she becomes very envious. Envy in James chapter 3, verse 16 and 17. So we're going to kind of see the foundation of a lot of things that happen in this chapter, just stemming from this one little root of bitterness, one little root of sin in their life. In James chapter 3, verse 14, beginning in verse 14, says, "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there." And so this is one of the driving motivators behind her right now. Envy. It brings out a big epic of carnality all the way around, trying to outdo each other, one-up each other. 1 Corinthians 3:3 talks about envy and strife and division, and Paul says, if you got those things, are you not carnal? You're not just behaving like mere men. So, maybe Jacob, maybe Rachel had begun to think, because she had not had children, that maybe something was wrong with her. Something was wrong with her relationship with God. Who knows what brings up this flash of anger by Jacob when, she didn't really need a lesson in theology. She really just needed her husband to listen to her, to show some understanding, to show that she could trust in his love. We really don't know exactly, what they got to see day to day, who caught whose eye, or where favoritism was shown. But she had reached a point where she was so envious of her sister that she blows up on Jacob one day, and he turns around and blows up back on her. Again, happy Valentine's Day. But this stuff is real and it happens. Or I could be the only one, but this stuff is real and it happens. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 8 and 9 says, "The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools." When we begin to carry around this envy or this jealousy, these struggles within our marriage, in our life, and we're not quick to forgive, as we'll read in a verse here soon, if we're not quick to listen, we begin to carry around this anger inside of us. Here in Ecclesiastes it says, "For anger rests in the bosom of fools." I think it's probably be foolish to say, if you caught somebody outside of one of these circumstances, say, "Well, sure hope I carry around a chip on my shoulder when it comes to coming home to my wife." Or, "Man, when my husband comes home, I sure want to get angry at him." We have those moments in the flesh, but generally speaking, we don't want to get to that place. We'd rather much be in a place of peace or blessing with those who we love. But as envy and these things begin to creep into our life, pretty soon we'll let them, instead of dealing with them, we'll let them get a foothold. And we begin to carry this anger, these things around with us. In James chapter 1, verse 19 and 20, says, "So then, my brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Here Jacob is not slow to speak. He's not quick to hear. And he lets his wrath fly. Nor do we see the righteousness of God produced in this chapter. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26 and 27 says, "Be angry and do not sin, and do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." Now, as we opened up, we saw that with envy and strife, as we're going to see in this chapter, there's confusion and all sorts of evil things that are there. And perhaps if they had begun to just simply practice a few of these things, to maybe not let the sun go down, to have a specific time that we're going to be reconciled. Hey, we're going to talk these things through. We're not going to let it keep festering and festering until we blow up or have distance between each other. We're not going to give place to the devil in our marriage. I'm going to hear what you have to say. I'm going to speak back with patience and wisdom. I'm not going to carry that anger around in my bosom, my insides, if you will. And I'm going to be slow to wrath. My wife and I, we really try to practice being slow to speak. Because it's always so tempting when you walk into that situation and and either way it goes, you never know sometimes what you're going to step into, and the other one gives some kind of snap or some kind of bite or whatever, dig. And you get that little flare inside of you that you really want to respond like Jacob, where he gets angry and responds. We try to really do our best to make it our policy to be slow to respond, to deal with it, but not off that initial flash of emotion. Verse 3. So she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go in to her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." Then she gave him Bilhah her maid as wife, and Jacob went in to her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. In desperation, Rachel gives her maid for Jacob to sleep with. God so loved the world that he gave. Much better result. Rachel was desperate and she gave. And Jacob might have been well to say, well, it didn't really work out very good with Grandpa. Remember Ishmael? Yeah, that didn't always work out so good. God ironed us out on that one. Maybe we shouldn't go down this road. But he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, when my mom was barren and not having any children, back in Genesis 25:21, my dad pleaded with the Lord, and God heard it, and they had a child. Maybe we should try that. He doesn't. Because remember, where there's envy and there's self-seeking and strife going on, it's a carnal affair. No stopping and seeking the Lord. No nothing. Here's my option in the flesh. And Jacob, as is his custom, especially in this chapter, goes along with it. Doesn't stand for righteousness. Just wanders here and there. We're going to find out that that's kind of really been his policy ever since the beginning, as he goes after working for 14 years to his father-in-law and then goes up and says, okay, now can I have what I've been working for? And has to make some kind of deal or bargain. We'll get to that in a little bit. Makes an interesting statement here that she should bear a child on my knees, as she gives her maiden to be his wife, concubine, however you want to say it. And it's interesting that in their culture, which we kind of got a picture of that with Abraham and Sarah, but in this phrase, some have found and suggest that in that culture, basically to be a child, to bear a child on my knees meant that either while they were having that child, they would recline in their lap, or against them, basically they would hold the mom as she would have the baby, or they would be present and doing the same thing during conception. That child wouldn't just be a surrogate child, but legally in their culture would have been Rachel's child. Either way, I can't imagine getting there. The desperation and not seeking the Lord, the desperation to keep up the envy of my sister to where I would even entertain this idea of bringing this into my life and into my marriage. But nevertheless, they did, and it gives a real insight of where their heart is and where their affection and mind is set. Verse 6, then Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he also has heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. I'm not sure how about Rachel's math, how 2 children by her concubine has prevailed over her sister who's already had 4 kids. Maybe it's because her sister had stopped having children. I don't know. But she counted that as a victory. There they come up with the latest version of the same old thing that just doesn't work. You can repackage a lot of things that we do and a lot of the mistakes our family has made or we ourselves have made, but if it's just repackaged in the flesh, it's just going to have the same result. Round and round we go. Same old thing. So she thinks she's prevailing against her sister. And now in verse 9 we come to Leah's turn. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, "A troop comes." So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, "I am happy, for daughters will call me blessed." So she called his name Asher. So here we have the same thing. We have a sister with the same sin going on. Her envy and strife and their struggle back and forth. Leah's turn, same sin, same fruit. Will allow others to violate the marriage bed just for the sake of beating the sister. You really see it come to light there in verse 13, where her total concern is for her own legacy, her own self, her image. They'll call me blessed, but it really doesn't say much about the child, just about me. Me, mine. And so long as it's better than Rachel's. And so here it keeps compounding upon each other. And again, we know the end, so we don't really think of it as all that big a deal, because here God's going to use it to build a nation, the tribes of Israel. But I couldn't imagine being, or one of my daughters being the maids in this mess. Verse 14. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. And Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you also take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, "God has taken away my reproach." So she called his name Joseph, and said, "The Lord shall add to me another son." So it kind of winds down there, at least for the time being. As far as having the child race, what a mess. What a mess. If the number 7 resembles the number of perfection or completion, in this 7 years that it took place, they made a complete or perfect mess, which God uses and cleans up. But I couldn't resist. What a mess. And it's interesting as you see them go along and give their own commentary. Oftentimes we do the same thing when we're in a selfish place or a bad place, that we'll make up our own theology, our own, this is what God's doing, or what have you. Because Leah there, as she's going along, she says, well, this is basically God's payment to me. Leah said, "God has given me my wages," in verse 18, "because I have given my maid to my husband." She called his name Issachar. God's one. God's not the debtor of anybody. God has paid me my wages. God is this. God is that. And it's interesting to me how oftentimes when well, I guess I've probably done it a handful of times, but you run into people from time to time, and they've either walked away from the Lord, or their life's on top of its head, and they're not coming back to the Lord. That they oftentimes have reasons or verses or different things that they've worked out where they're all right. God's actually in it, or what have you, or it's all a result of the church, someone else's fault, but they rarely own up to it themselves. But when we walk in the light, we don't have to make up the story. We don't have to make up the theology for ourselves. Others will be able to see it clearly and understand what God is and what God is not doing in our life. But these guys aren't, so they kind of got to make up some of their own what's going on. Mandrakes, the love apple in Hebrew. A little bit of back and forth on what exactly that was. Mandrakes were a root thought to have some kind of properties for helping you to have children or for an aphrodisiac. Some argue that, well, they're slightly poisonous and it may have actually been ginseng. I don't know. It says mandrake, so I'm going to go with that. But here Rachel kind of has Leah in a position to where, whether it's because of the two maids that he's sleeping with now, and it seems that Jacob's probably in his 80s at this point, or if he's back with Rachel at this point, that he had not been spending time with Leah. And so she trades the mandrakes essentially for time with her husband. What a mess. Again, happy Valentine's Day. This is great. This is great. Envy, strife, bitterness. I know most of you guys have been around long enough to when you watch a root grow underneath something. Doesn't matter if it's the strongest foundation or asphalt or concrete, it will break it if you let it grow. And it continues to grow in this family. But the Lord is in their life, and He will bring these things back around to His purposes. But if it were not for the Lord, what a mess, what a true mess that they would have. We'll see that more and more as it continues to unfold here. But this here does seem to end the battle of the children. And it's interesting here as 24 as it ends that this would be a very special son that would eventually save all their lives during a horrible famine in Egypt as he would become ruler. Interesting to think about the things that God uses. So as we come here, we're going to come to a section where Jacob's going to make an agreement with Laban. So basically, since he ended that first 7 years and got Leah for a wife, and then Rachel as well, it's been about 7 years, time passed, and during that time, they've had 11 children. I never really thought about how close in age all of those kids were, but they're all basically within 7 years of each other. Because he's about to end his 14th year of service here, and they had 11 kids in 7 years. Yuck.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are no Pampers, man. That'd be a lot of scrubbing. But I suppose they probably had some servants doing that or something. But an interesting age range in the family is Jacob's probably in his 80s. He's got 11 kids under 7, or 7 and under 7. He's got wives. We're not really sure how old Rachel and Leah are. Definitely not over menopause. It won't be for a little while. Interesting family mix. You know, something that they had done, I believe, is ignored the wisdom of God that through the working of their heritage in Abraham and Isaac, that they had not applied wisdom. Wisdom essentially is the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. The quality of being wise. Another definition, the soundness of an action or decision with regard to the application of experience, knowledge, and good judgment. They didn't look back at Abraham and Sarah and look for good judgment. They didn't look at Isaac and Rebekah and apply what they had learned and what God had done in their family and apply it with any wisdom. Lacked it. And it made me think, as I was kind of just praying about different applications, or what did he say at that point, and God took me kind of on a whole different route. As I came across a couple articles and things on the state of our debt in our country. You know, the first time I really felt the sting of a financial change was when the internet bubble burst there around the new millennium. Many of us felt it in 2008 or the end of 2007, there for a couple of years. The Great Recession, they called it, because it was the greatest economic problem since World War II. It was also referred to as the global financial crisis. And now, American households and homes are approaching and exceeding the personal debt that we had in 2008, 2007, leading up to it. Both in credit card debt and in household debt. Right now in America, the total household debt in America is $13.1 trillion. Now that includes homes and school loans and credit cards and etc. But America, not even the government, not all the states, just American people as families owe $13.1 trillion. You could take $100 bills and fill this entire sanctuary with that money. That's what we owe. Credit card debt of American families is about to hit $1.5 trillion just of credit card debt. Again, meeting and exceeding where we were before we had a financial meltdown. The average credit card debt in America is $16,500 just in credit card debt. Of course, we know that our debt as a nation is $19 trillion. And some argue that we will never be able to pay it back. Some argue that we can. And we've just passed budgets and tax breaks that will increase that by a couple more $1 trillion. You know, we live in such a wealthy and blessed country. But it was a good reminder to me that we also live in a house of cards. And if we look at that, you know, we so much of what's going on right now is we live not with our own prosperity, but the plan with that our future is going to be prosperous. We've bankrolled everything that it's going to work out. Like a rich kid. Well, it's all going to be okay because it always has been. And so we'll borrow and we'll do all these things and we'll live outside of our means. And we too are not doing a good job of learning from our past. I know it's realized it's completely different than what's in the chapter, but it was just something that, for myself, the Lord was reminding me to get a few of the things in my own house in order in regards to this, because we really kind of have a narrow window right now. The economy is doing okay, jobs are increasing, things are doing well. But a reminder that we also kind of live in a glass house, and it wouldn't take much of a rock or a terrorist attack or some small thing to where all of this debt would crumble down. Anyways, do with that what you will. That was just something that was on my heart. I was thinking about wisdom and learning from the past, and then a few of these articles popped up, and it was a good reminder of give us a handful of years and an improved economy, and we forget all about what happened and we roll on. So we'll come to the second half of Jacob's agreement with Laban. Verse 25. It came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob had said to Laban, Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you." Now I understand that Jacob's in the school of discipleship here as he's kind of left the Hard Rock Hotel there back in Bethel and moved to the school of discipleship here under Uncle Laban. But at some point he's going to have to man up a little bit. But here we see Jacob, after he's served for 14 years for really no pay, he's really gotten nothing, and he's got to go to his father-in-law and say, "Well, can you give me that now? Would you please give me that? Can I have that?" Now, I know they had an agreement, but I would have to say myself, I'd be like, "Well, 14 years are up. I'll see you later." There's not really a, "Hey, can you give me all this? Because I worked for it." It would be, "Hey, I'm checking out." Yeah. But who's in charge? We're going to see that in for a little bit now. Jacob here letting his father-in-law have a little too much sway. But there's a real principle in that continues on from marriage, and that is, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife." There's a whole train wreck of marriage in here that God had never designed anything more than one man and one woman. That the father-in-law, this whole situation, not allowing them to leave and to be joined together and starting that new family, and just bearing fruit all over the place of just kind of not walking out the way God had made things. Not made for polygamy, not made for this whole mess. But now he's ready to go. Verse 27, "And Laban said to him, 'Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake.' Then he said, 'Name me your wages, and I will give it.' So Jacob said to him, 'You know how I have served you, and how your livestock have been with me. For what you have had before I came was little, and it has increased unto the great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now, when shall I also provide for my own house?' So he said, 'What shall I give you?' And Jacob said, 'You shall not give me anything. If you will do this one thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks.'" So he's ready to go. Laban starts striking up another deal. "Hey man, I know that I'm blessed when you're around. Why don't you stick around for a little while longer?" Good father-in-law probably would a long time ago and said, "Boy, you need to get a job and make a way to provide for your family." But here at the end of 14 years, he's getting ready to go with his family, and he doesn't really have anything. So he's going to work for a while, and he says, "Name your wages." And so Jacob's going to work out a deal with Laban. We've all, as we go along, we've all got a Laban in our life that will continually be a problem for us. But a knife's not really sharpened by something softer than it. We've got to have these trials and these people in our life. God uses them to mold us, to shape us. And again, Jacob is in that kind of school of discipleship where he's learning how to trust in the Lord and to follow the Lord. And here again, he's going to get in the middle of a deal with his father-in-law that it's not going to go quite according to plan in the end when he goes to leave. But God's working in it. And God had already promised back in Genesis 28, when he was sleeping on that rock, that God would not only be with him, but he would bring him back and he would accomplish. He wouldn't leave him until absolutely everything was accomplished. And I love that because it kind of sets the parameters for what's going on as they move ahead. going to have one guy that can say, well, if you give me the bad odds, I'm still going to be blessed. And the father-in-law is going to say, all right, the odds are in my favor. Because there in verse 31, he says, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you do this one thing, I will again feed and keep your flocks. So Jacob says, I don't want anything from you. He wants to earn it. He's going to work for it. So let's see what he's got there. In verse 32, let me pass through all of your flock, today removing from there all the speckled, all the spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and the speckled among the goats. And these shall be my wages, so my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes before you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs, all be considered stolen if it is with me. And Laban said, oh, that it were according to your word. So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So Jacob, he's no knucklehead when it comes to being around the animals. He's been around them for a while. He knows that trying to get the defected or the speckled or the spotted out of this good flock, it's not really in his favor. Laban sees that as well. Says, right on, son, let's go for that. Good deal. So they separate them out, and just to make sure there is no mixing or no confusion, they separate by 3 days' journey. Verse 37. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and the chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters. And in the watering troughs there were flocks that came to drink, so that they could conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. That's one of the sections that everybody's got an opinion on. Everybody scratches their head and no one really knows why in the world Jacob does this. It's interesting to note that the word conceived there in verse 39 literally means in Hebrew to make hot, that it is possible that whatever he was doing was causing the flocks or the females to go into heat. Don't really know. It's just conjecture. Henry Morris noted that some of the materials mentioned in some of these trees here, there's chemicals that the ancients did use for fertility and to use as an aphrodisiac as well. Whether that's what Jacob was doing, that somehow what was ever in these sticks and peels and of almonds and all this, whether that actually did anything, again, the debate rages because it doesn't really seem to be backed up by any kind of science whatsoever. But the fact is he did it. Some ancients have continued to do it. Maybe Jacob, he was kind of a trickster. Maybe he simply, because he knew God was going to bless him, threw some of that stuff out there, so Laban thought something cool was going on. I don't know. Then he'd go back and see Uncle Laban putting sticks out, and he'd giggle. I don't know. Maybe. That's maybe what I would have done. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the fact was God was going to bless Jacob. And as one friend of mine said, Jacob probably could have hit him with spit wads, and they still would have been blessed and reproduced like crazy. Because God was with him. And oftentimes we see this in Scripture where guys and gals will do strange things and God will use it. It's like a point of contact for our faith, if you will. Sometimes when we think we really need to meet the Lord, we Well, I need to go to church. Why? Well, because that's what we associate sometimes, depending on where we're at with meeting the Lord. The lady who had a bleeding issue for 12 years, if I just touch the hem of his garment. In Acts, if we just touch Peter's shadow or Paul's sweat rag. There wasn't anything to any of it except for God used their faith in some goofy circumstance. Because He's good. And if He waited for us to get it right, He might not ever get the opportunity to bless us. So in our goofiness or strange things, God meets us. So whether or not there's something to all this, we may never know this side of heaven, except for the fact that Jacob did his best and God blessed him for it. And I think that's really all any of us got is, here's what we know, here's what God wants us to do, and if we give it our best with a whole heart, God will be in it and He'll bless it. And whether or not that's the new formula for being blessed and having it all worked out, probably not. Any more than if you spit in mud and rub it in some blind guy's eyes that he'll be healed. Worked for Jesus, but probably won't work for you. And God's into that. He's not really into creating the formulas. Just do what you know. Do it with your whole heart. God will be in it, as He was with Jacob. Verse 40. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face forward, the streaked and all the brown in the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves, and he did not put them with Laban's flocks. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in, so the feebler were with Laban's, and the stronger with Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, female and male servants, camels, and donkeys. So exceedingly prosperous, basically, literally caused him to burst out exceedingly prosperous. A friend of mine tried to do the math on this a while back, and he said, a good healthy lamb in a year can have 2 lambs. And so he was just trying to take with the guesstimate of the flock and how it would double each 6 months. And he very well wound up with this gentleman came up with 50,000, but I would say probably a little bit less. But this massive flock. He started with nothing, and at the end of 6 years, very well would have had tens of thousands of goats and sheep and camel, because they were blessed, and everything was just all blessed. Everything that he did. And then he stuck the feebler ones with Laban. That made me giggle too, because I don't know. Which it wasn't necessarily wrong, because Laban said, "Hey, name your price." Well, I guess that was part of his price. Should have read the fine print, Laban. You got all the weak ones. But a few things I want to kind of close with are when you walk in the promises of God. When we look at, I've spent a large part of my life working for other people, and when you're in that situation and you're walking in the promises of God, you don't need to make wealth your goal. Jacob didn't, as we see in 25 and verse 26. He simply just wanted his family. His goal wasn't to get rich and to basically take all of Laban's. Originally, he just wanted to take his family and go. Then Laban tried to spark up a new deal. Number 2, you don't need to be afraid to work to increase the wealth of those you work for, either before or while you're working on your own life. It's good. In fact, it's good that God would bless those who you work for or are in your life while you're serving them. That's a good thing. It happens with Joseph. It happens with a number of people in the Scriptures too. Just have that heart to where, and we'll see, we see both, actually chapter 31, verse 38 and 40 of Genesis probably give the best description of that. And Jacob's response later, and we'll get to this later as well. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried their young, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. That which was torn by beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. You acquired it from my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was, and the day of drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I have been in your house 20 years. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 6 times. He was a man that could rest in what God was doing. And he could work hard to bless a rat. And he even ate some of the losses. He didn't have to worry about that because God was with him. Number 3, work hard, dedicating yourself to your employer's success. And finally, number 4, just trust in God. Verse 31 through 33 of this chapter. Just trust in the Lord. He's got your back. He's working in it. So the first half of the chapter there, let us learn from the past, whether it be in our marriage or our finances. Let's grow a heart of wisdom. And then trust God in serving those who you're under authority of. I want to close with Proverbs chapter 21, verse 30. Which says, there is no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord. So, Father, may we be patient with each other, especially for marriages, Lord, as we see the envy and the strife that's caused by jealousy, lack of attention, bringing the wrong things in the marriage, let roots of bitterness or envy, strife. Lord, help us to keep these things out of our marriage. Lord, may we be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Lord, because our anger will not produce your righteousness. It just doesn't bear good fruit. Lord, so even when we're angry, Lord, help us to be that, but not to sin, and to walk in you. Help us to be wise and to serve anyone and anything, situation that we are, as unto you. God bless these guys in this night, in Jesus' name.